Well, good morning, and welcome again to Holy Covenant, and welcome also to those of you watching online. It is good to have you all here with us. This is the beginning of our 50th anniversary series. Today we celebrate the open table. Will you pray with me? Holy Wisdom, come, sit at our table, share in our feast with us, and feed us with your grace. Fill us with understanding. Help us to share it with others, your love and hope for all your children. Amen. Born again. Now, there's an evangelical phrase, if there ever was one. Some of you may have been part of a tradition in which you were supposed to be born again, or part of that Jesus movement in the 70s, with the emphasis on a singular moment of feeling as if you had been reborn. In the evangelical tradition, or in certain parts of it, that experience is required before you can be baptized. And you're baptized not as an infant, but as a young adult or a teenager. And so you have to have had this born-again experience. And I see some of you nodding your heads. Yes, you were interrogated, so to speak, to be sure you really had the right sort of experience before you could be baptized and a full member of the faith. And yet, I'm not sure Jesus really meant to give the phrase that much power and meaning. He seems to be speaking simply of a rebirth of heart, of the spirit, a newness of you, if you will, of spirit, which is how Paul described it later in the epistles. Born again. That October Sunday in 1968, the church was born again, wasn't it? When Troy Perry got together with some friends in his living room in Los Angeles, California, and preached, and offered communion, and played a recording of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, God bless him, and every single one of those people were LGBT or allies, the church was born again. Do you realize how unheard of that event was? We're kind of used to it now. MCC and all the mainstream churches have their more lights and reconciling ministries and dignity and so on. And many of them ordain and marry LGBTQ people, but 50 years ago? Girlfriend, come on. 12 LGBTQ people got together and had church, communion and everything. For the first time in the history of the world, out openly LGBTQ people had a worship service. And guess what? The roof didn't fall in. Lightning did not strike. California did not fall off the U.S. into the Pacific. And the world did not end. Amazing. Amazing. And look where we are. Look how many denominations, Christian and Jewish, ordain, marry, recognize LGBTQ people and couples. No, it's not where it should be, not by a long shot, but we're way ahead of where we were 50 years ago. Change happens. Born again. I look around, it seems to me lots of things could stand to be born again. I'll name a few, I bet you have some too. Criminal justice system, healthcare, education. I know you could name more. Lots of things need to be born again, don't they? Lots of systems, hierarchies need to be changed, turned right upside down. But let's look at how Troy did it. Did he go into the Presbyterian church and try to change things? Did he ask the Pentecostals, that's the tradition he came from, by the way, did he ask them to rearrange their thinking? No. The Methodists? Fat chance there, folks. I left them 15 years ago, and they're still arguing over it. That's not going to be happening anytime soon. Troy built a new church. But he didn't do it from scratch. And this, I think, is something that is brilliant. Now, he didn't do it all on his own. He had help, obviously. There were other elders. But what Troy and the other elders did was brilliant. They took something from the traditions that people had left, and they put them together. From the Methodists, they took those conferences, those meetings of pastors and congregational leaders, bringing news to each other of good and bad in the local churches, making connections with each other, mutual support. From the Presbyterians, he brought the idea of elders, some ordained, some not, but leaders of the church, specially chosen to do the spiritual work of the church. They were to be the theologians, serve communion, create worship, be spiritual guides, and so on in the local churches. From the Pentecostals, he brought dynamic preaching, and if any of you know or have heard Reverend Elder Troy preaching, that's some dynamic preaching, let me tell you. And the laying on of hands in prayer. From the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics, we were given formal communion and a sacramental understanding. Now, this did two things. Not only did Troy take what he saw as the best from these traditions, but then as people from these traditions came into MCC, they found something that was familiar within MCC. A Roman Catholic may not have been familiar with the idea of conferences or non-ordained people consecrating communion, but she was very happy to receive communion every week. It was what she knew. The Methodist wasn't too sure about what speaking in tongues was all about, but he knew what conference was, and so on. Born again, but not from scratch. No need to reinvent the wheel, right? And there's enough there for almost everyone to find something that they know. The temptation, when we're faced with incompetence or massive failure or simply not enough or being turned away, is to say, tear it down. Start all over. I'm done. I just tear it all down, burn it down. But that isn't always the best idea. Sometimes you can just take the best parts and build something new. Gut it and start again. Think of how many times buildings have been repurposed. Barns and churches become homes. Stores and shops become bars or bingo halls or churches. Baltimore MCC was once a car repair shop. My favorite bar in Windsor, it's called Vermouth, but actually their best drink is a mojito, go figure, had been a haberdashery. They sold hats and gloves and such around the turn of the century, once upon a time. They still had the huge mirrors along one wall, which actually was perfect for a bar. A nature center I used to take classes at as a child had been a barn. It was a working barn at the time. When I was going there, they still had the goats. They had sheep and horses and pigs and all kinds of things. It was a working barn. Now it's a wedding venue. So things get repurposed and redone. I had lived in an apartment building once that had been a telephone exchange. Things get reused. Nothing has to remain the same. When the time is right, change can happen. The repair shop becomes a church. The church becomes a quilt shop. The barn becomes a home. The store becomes a theater. The group of strangers becomes a congregation. The congregation becomes a denomination. And 50 years later, here we are. One of the most important decisions Troy made about that service was to offer communion. It wasn't a big part of his tradition, but he knew that many LGBT plus people had been turned away from communion or hadn't been able to receive it because they'd stayed away from church, because they were afraid of what they would hear from the pulpit. And so they hadn't received communion in a long time. So he knew it was important to offer it, and so he did. Today, MCCs offer communion every week. It's part of our mandate. It's actually in our bylaws that every MCC has to offer communion every week. Not necessarily every service, but every week. And we also have an open table. You don't have to be a member of this church or any church in order to receive God's gifts. We say it every week here at Holy Covenant, and I think every MCC in the world says it every week. We don't want anyone to come to church and be turned away or feel that they're not welcome at communion. We'll be celebrating our 50 years of existence for 5 weeks, one for each decade. And each week, we'll be remembering some important aspect of what we do and who we are as MCC. And today we remember that open table and Troy's hospitality in opening his own living room, his own home for that first worship service. Many emerging churches today worship that same way, 10 or 15 people gathered in a living room, sharing a meal, sharing communion, discussing a reading, sharing a few prayers, taking up some money to pay for whatever they need, and then saying goodbye. Open table, a church born again, 50 years. Who knows what the next 50 years will bring? In all God's names, amen.